Dr. Charlotta Piesinger from Denmark. She is an MD, a medical doctor, as well as a Master of Public Health. And she works at the Forskningscenter for Forebyggelse og Sundhed i København. Electrical cigarettes have been among the things that she has been researching on and publishing on, and she has also an extensive experience as an advisor and therapist in terms of helping people to quit smoking. So it's nice to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I will be speaking about electronic cigarettes today. I have nothing to declare. The e-cigarettes are a hot topic, and I have worked with tobacco control and tobacco research for 20 years almost, and I have never experienced anything like this. This is really something that is dividing the waters. Public health people, researchers who have worked many years with tobacco control, they are standing and screaming at each other at conferences. There are strong feelings in these topics. There are testimonies like this that the electronic cigarettes changed people's life. And of course, when I read a statement like this, that vaping has given me the confidence to regain my life back from the cigarettes and from being a social outcast, that is something that impresses me and makes me think. And I have been thinking a lot. In the beginning, I was very excited about electronic cigarettes, and the longer I have worked with them, the more concern I have. The e-cigarette industry has some statements. They say that this is pure water vapor with natural flavorings, completely safe for bystanders, it is a healthy alternative to smoking, it is fantastic aid to help smokers quit smoking, and it prevents young people from starting smoking. So these are basically the themes that I will go through. First, some new terms. People, they don't say that they smoke e-cigarette, they vapor. They are vapor them and they vape cigarettes, e-cigarettes. So what comes out, what they exhale is vapor. So a short introduction. Basically, this is a new nicotine delivery system. And in the beginning, with the first generation, it looked like cigarettes. They were disposable. Now we are at the fourth generation, and they have big containers that can be refilled and customized. And as you see, you can get them in all shapes and colors, even with gold and diamonds. And how does it work? Well, there is a liquid container. Now the liquid containers are quite big. And then there is a battery-operated heating element. And the puffing activates the heating element, and then the liquid is vaporized. The e-cigarettes were invented in China by a pharmacist, but in the last years, the tobacco industry has been buying up, and there has been an aggressive marketing which resulted in explosive increase of sale. The content of e-cigarettes are basically that there are vapor-producing agents, more than 90% of them, and that is typically propylene glycol and or glycerine. Then there is nicotine, and most of the e-cigarettes sold, they are with nicotine, and many kind of flavors. More than 8,000 different flavors have been identified. And then there is water, alcohol, and some chemical additives. And the marketing themes are sex, glamour, freedom, independence, enjoying life, As with conventional cigarettes and now also safety, you can vape when you are in bed with your little child. So let's look at the evidence on health. In 2014, I published a systematic review. It was the first systematic review of e-cigarettes and health. Together with my colleague Martin Dössing, we identified 99 studies. And in 2015, I was contacted by World Health Organization, who asked me for an update. And for that, I found 175 studies. And this has been used as the background paper for World Health Organization's conclusions on electronic cigarettes. Then I have performed another search in November 2016. So what I present here is the sum of the evidence of these studies. As you see, most of the studies are on the content of fluid and vapor. Then there are studies reporting adverse events and studies with human experiments and a few animal experiments. The general findings first. This is a brand new research field and there are many methodological challenges. We have no standard e-cigarette, as I said. There are more than 500 brands. And what we find in one brand and in one e-cigarette, we don't necessarily find in another brand. There is also no standard vaping machine as we have smoking machines for testing. Most studies, they compared with cigarettes or with smokers. And this is a very, very different product. So we are looking for what we know is harmful in cigarettes, but what causes harm might be something we don't know yet. Then there has been a lot of misleading or missing information on the product ingredients, and worst of all, we have no studies with long-term follow-up yet. A serious concern is that a third of the studies have conflict of interest. The studies are especially studies looking at content of fluid and vapor, and the tobacco industry has been producing a lot of studies recently. And here is a typical study. You can see that there are a lot of harmful substances in cigarettes, and when we look at the e-cigarettes, the levels are so low that they are almost not measurable. But when we look at the who has sponsored the study and performed it, it is the tobacco industry. And one of my students sat down and made two piles of all the articles on fluid and vapor of e-cigarettes. And in one pile, she put all the studies that concluded that there were negative health effects, and the other one, there were no negative health effects. And as you see, studies without conflict of interest, only 13% did not find negative health effects, whereas studies with industry conflict of interest, they found between 74 and 100% that there were no negative health effects. We are replicating this in a blinded study, so these are preliminary results. The major ingredient is propylene glycol. It is also used in theater fog and also in asthma inhalers, but there is a huge difference between taking 2 inhalations a day of inhaler and inhaling big amounts of heated vapor with propylene glycol many hundred times a day. In 2013, the e-cigarette industry, they paid a chemist to make a technical report on e-cigarettes, and he concluded that the estimated levels of exposure to propylene glycol and glycerine are close enough to threshold limit values to warrant concern, and the threshold limit values are based on uncertainty rather than knowledge. The studies on fluid and vapor. Many harmful substances have been identified. Fine and ultrafine particles, carcinogenic tobacco-specific nitrosamines, carcinogenic carbonyls, harmful metals, volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, etc. And mostly these were found in lower or much lower concentrations than in cigarettes, but results are very conflicting. Some find them in most brands and samples, others in few or no. Some find them in high concentrations, others in low or trace levels. And again, in general, studies that have severe conflicts of interest, they have findings that indicate little or no harm. Here is an example of the conflicting results on particles. We know that fine particles and ultrafine particles are associated with increased mortality. And when we look at the particle size, the studies conclude that one study say that they are, or some studies that they are comparable in size, or much smaller, or much bigger, or that size alters in the human lung. When it comes to particle count, there are studies showing that the particle count is extremely high, that it is double the dose from tobacco smoke, or the same dose as in tobacco smoke, or lower, up to an order of magnitude lower than in smoke, or that it converges in the lung. So what shall we conclude on this? However, we know that the toxicants and potentially carcinogenic substances, they are absorbed in the body. They have been found both in urine and in breath of vapors. You might think this is advertising for cupcakes or some sweets, but this is advertising for e-cigarettes. You can vape and lose weight, 50 servings with 0 calories. Very tempting for young women. Flavors are essential part of e-cigarettes. And the flavors used are typically approved as safe for oral intake, but there is a huge difference between eating something and inhaling it. And for example, there is something called diacetyl. It is a food sweetener and is completely safe for eating. However, those who work in the popcorn industry and are exposed to vapor with a lot of diacetyl in, they develop popcorn lungs, which is a disease that reminds of COPD. And diacetyl has been found in 75% of the e-cigarette samples. The highest toxicity levels in e-cigarettes has been found associated with some specific flavors, high voltage devices, overheating, dripping and dry puff conditions, a little difficult to explain here in short time, but way of using e-cigarettes. In the second half of a vaping period by reuse and the different types of vaporizers. And as you see, this has nothing to do with cigarettes. This is another product with another harms. Then there are experiments where cells have been exposed to fluid or vapor extracts. I'm not sure if all of you are health professionals. I thought this was for doctors primarily, so maybe you don't understand all the expressions, but I will take some of them. So there is a dysregulation of gene expression and genotoxicity, and it seems that vapor changes the gene expression in a similar way to tobacco smoke, and there are increased DNA strand breaks and cell death independently of the nicotine content, and a loss of lung endothelial epithelial barrier function. Many studies have found cytotoxic effects and increased oxidative stress and inflammation, and also studies has found that e-cigarettes, they promote infection, both viral infection and bacterial infection. The animal experimental studies have been performed both with neonatal mice, where we see that exposure to e-cigarettes results in diminished alveolar cell proliferation and impairment in postnatal lung growth, and there is an adverse impact on weight gain. They are born smaller. In adult mice, we see asthmatic reaction and inflammation of airways, a decreased pulmonary antibacterial defense, and higher mortality when they are exposed to virus infection. And long-term exposure in adult mice results in development of asthma and emphysema, and there are effects associated with development of COPD. Then there are human experimental studies from the pulmonary system. Some studies find that the particle doses in the lungs are the same as with smoking, that there is a significant inhibition of cough reflex sensibility, and we drop the exhaled nitric oxide. That's a little bit complicated, but there is a significant airway obstruction also. Many studies have shown this in different ways, and most of these studies have been with healthy smokers, healthy volunteer smokers, and there has been an underexposure because they didn't know how to vape. It is a quite different technique when you vape than when you smoke. So they didn't inhale sufficiently. Most of these were healthy volunteers, but one study included COPD patients and asthma patients, and they found there was an immediate significant airway obstruction. A study looked at lung function after smoking or vaping. After smoking, there was an immediate significant drop in lung function, whereas the drop was not significant after vaping session, but after 1 hour of exposure, the smoking and vaping, after smoking or vaping, the lung function was the same. So we see that the effects on the lungs remind very much of what we see with smoking, but less pronounced. Then there's the cardiovascular system. There are some older studies that didn't find influence on different parameters. And again, at that time, the studies were not very well performed, and actually you couldn't measure nicotine in blood. So they were not exposed enough. There was an underexposure, but in the newer studies, there is a negative, has been shown a negative effect on stiffness of aorta, similar to smoking, on flow-mediated dilatation, and blood pressure and heart rate increased, and there was a shift in the autonomic balance towards sympathetic predominance and increased oxidative stress. Then there are human experiments with the nose, mouth, and throat, and they found a significant increase in the inflammation of the gums when tobacco smokers, they switched from conventional cigarettes to e-cigarettes, and that was after only 2 weeks. And there were some negative effects on nose and the sinuses, on the symptoms, and the clearance of the mucociliary clearance and blood flow to oral mucosa. Then there are adverse event surveys, and longitudinal studies have been performed, and there are conflicting results. On one hand, we find that people report symptoms, negative symptoms from all organ systems. most frequently they have adverse events from the respiratory system and the mouth. On the other hand, there have been no serious adverse events in prospective studies and randomized controlled trials, and a study found decrease in respiratory symptoms, and some people report improvements in general health. But these studies are mostly highly biased. There is a selection bias, so it's not very good evidence. We have 3 large cross-sectional epidemiological studies. The largest of these included more than 45,000 students in China, and they found that e-cigarettes were significantly associated with self-reported respiratory symptoms, doctor's diagnosis of asthma, absence from school, and chronic cough, phlegm, and bronchitis symptoms. And that was even when you took into account different other factors that could influence this as exposure to passive smoking. And there have been a lot of adverse events, case reports, of course, even though there was a time association and reversibility in all of these described case reports, it is not the same as causality. Only for the contact dermatitis, there was evidence that there actually was a nickel allergy involved. And more reports are coming on explosions. The new 4th generation e-cigarettes have high voltages, and sometimes they explode, resulting in laceration, burns, and fractures, it can also result, and there are also reports on fatal poisonings with nicotine, and sometimes they get more attention when it is a dog that has been poisoned than when it's a child. There might be some unexpected effects. A study found that there is interaction between radon that comes from the underground and side stream vapor from e-cigarettes, and they found that the increase in the attached potential alpha energy concentration was higher from e-cigarettes than from traditional cigarettes. And this is, of course, of concern because both radon and smoking are associated with lung cancer. So the conclusions on health are that there is increasing body indicating risk, but the glass is still half full. I have many sleepless nights before I wrote these conclusions, but I concluded that due to many methodological problems, many studies with severe conflicts of interest, inconsistencies and contradictions in results, rapidly changing designs of the product and lack of long-term follow-up, no firm conclusion can be drawn on the safety of the e-cigarettes. However, we are dealing with a very addictive product, and there is an increasing body of evidence indicating harm, but probably e-cigarettes are less harmful than conventional cigarettes if we compare product to product. I will come back to that. And it is not meaningful to speak of risk of vaping of e-cigarettes as risk of one product, because the risk depends on the brand, the batch, the flavor, the heating, the vaporizer, how dirty or worn the e-cigarette is, the way of vaping, and many factors that we still don't know. Maybe some of you have read or heard about the report that came from Public Health England in 2015, where they concluded that e-cigarettes are 95% less harmful than tobacco. That was, of course, extremely good news in the vapor societies, but the report has been very criticized. And the critique has been published both in Lancet and British Medical Journal. And first of all, it is based on good old boys sitting around the table. The lowest evidence we have, a few experts, all of them were harm reduction advocates, and several of them had severe conflicts of interest. Some of them have never worked with tobacco control, and they included primarily studies on the content of vapor and fluid. They didn't include, for example, the animal studies, so they selected the studies. And they were sponsored by different sponsors, for example, Euro-Swiss Health, where they also had the meeting, and Euro-Swiss Health had connections with British American Tobacco. So, is it completely safe for bystanders? Is there passive vaping? World Health Organization has also asked for a background paper on this topic, and their conclusion is that they have two conclusions: that chemicals are taken into the bodies of bystanders. This is evidenced by cotinine measures. Cotinine is the product, a metabolic product of nicotine uptake. And the content and concentration of toxic substances is highly variable. Let's first look at some of the studies without conflict of interest. For example, there is an experimental study that found increased pulmonary obstruction, and they found nicotine in blood of bystanders. Indoor air, there has been found high concentrations of ultrafine particles and aluminium and carcinogenic substances in exhaled breath, and high concentrations of toxic metals, higher than after indoor smoking. There are two real-life studies that have looked at bystander or passive vaping. One concluded that the concentration of cotinine, the metabolic product of nicotine, among non-smokers who were exposed to conventional cigarettes and e-cigarettes were the same. So if you are standing beside a smoker or one who is vaping, you have the same level of nicotine in your blood. You absorb it. Then there was another study where there was a 2-day e-cigarette event where there were up to almost 90 active vapers in the event room that were vaping, and they were measuring the ultrafine particles, and they found that the concentration observed were higher than concentrations reported in hookah cafes, water pipe cafes, and bars that allow smoking. And then there are studies that have conflict of interest, and I don't need to go into detail with these. They conclude that there is no reason to worry. The harm reduction theory, I will go through this, that e-cigarettes are a healthy alternative to smoking. A few weeks ago, a study was published in England, a cross-sectional study with including long-term users of conventional cigarettes or e-cigarettes only, or nicotine patch only, or nicotine products only, or dual use of e-cigarettes and smoking, or dual use of nicotine products and smoking. And they concluded that e-cigarette only had users, they had significantly lower levels in urine and blood of carcinogens and toxins than smokers. And if they were dual users and smokers only, they had largely the similar levels of carcinogens and toxin exposure. So this seems very promising, that if you quit smoking and switch to e-cigarettes, you have lower levels of carcinogens and toxins in your blood and urine. And this is how advocates for harm reduction, they put it, that if you switch to snus or e-cigarettes, we will prevent all these horrible deaths from cigarettes. And they are always presenting Sweden as the golden example. And you can see at your left side that the smoking prevalence in Sweden has been declining for decades, and at the same time, smokeless tobacco has been going up, and that has resulted in very low rates of lung cancer, for example. So they explain this one by this one. What they forget is that Sweden has had very, very strong tobacco control for decades. They started in the 50s, when Denmark, at that time, we were just sleeping in tobacco control. Whereas there has been no control of smokeless tobacco. Let's see in the rest of the world, how does it look? Well, when we look at US, we have another finding, that in Sweden, we actually see that states with high prevalence of snus use, they have higher prevalence of smoking. Okay, is snus, we have had snus for decades now, do we have studies that really are convincing, showing us that this is a good product to quit smoking? No. Actually, the results of the few trials that have been, they are so depressing that the tobacco industry choose not to publish a negative randomized controlled trial of camel snus for smoking cessation. They achieved rates below 5%, and there was no difference in the three arms. The other arms was placebo and nicotine product. And the equally low rates, quit rates, have been found in other studies. So we have no proof whatsoever that snus is going to make people quit smoking. Let's go back to e-cigarettes. The rationale for harm reduction is very simple and very, very tempting. You take a very harmful product as cigarettes, and you replace it with a less harmful product, e-cigarettes or snus, or the new harm-reduced heat, no-burn cigarettes. That's so simple that even our politicians can understand it. But if you take 10 vapors, 8 out of them are also smoking. I was shocked. That was the time when I went from being very excited about e-cigarettes to being very concerned, because this is real life. So this is not only Denmark. This is going on all over the world. All the studies I have been able to identify, between 70% and 80% of those who use e-cigarettes, they also smoke. So the reality is that instead of switching to a less harmful product, they use this less harmful product as a supplement. So they buy e-cigarettes in order to quit, they try to quit, they relapse, and then they end up with dual use. Then you can say, but if the smoker reduces the number of cigarettes substantially, then dual use maybe is good for his health, isn't it? This could be true, and this is based on two assumptions. The first assumption is that reduction of number of cigarettes really has a significant effect on health. And the second is that vapors do reduce the number of conventional cigarettes So let's see if that is true. First, the health benefits of reduced smoking intensity. There are some very large studies on this, and they show that halving or more of daily intake of number of cigarettes does not reduce all-cause mortality, incidence of cardiovascular disease, or smoking-related cancer or cancer mortality. However, 2 studies showed small reductions of lung cancer risk. Is there a reduction in number of conventional cigarettes by vapers by dual users? No, it is not reported. In all the studies I've been able to identify, they report no change or more or less no change. And we know extremely little about the health effects of the combined vaping and smoking. Is there a cocktail effect? Is there some kind of synergy between these unhealthy products? Very few studies have reported on this, and most of them show no change or negative health effects. In total, 25 dual users report positive health effects, but I think that is not strong evidence. Also, is there an increase in use? You can have your e-cigarette, bring it with you everywhere. It is just, you just take it and you poof, and you light it. You don't have to light a whole cigarette and burn it. So what I hear and what I read on the internet is statements like this: I vape way more than I smoked. I never vaped in the house or car, and now I vape almost everywhere I go. When I was smoking, I would smoke around a pack and a half a day. Now that I'm vaping all day long. I vape all day and half the night. Maybe you remember advertising like this, the lady here. It is advertising from the 80s. The tobacco industry has had many, many attempts of presenting harm-reduced products, filters, low tar, and light cigarettes. And here the lady is advertising light cigarettes. And she's saying, considering all I heard, I decided to either quit or smoke through. I smoked through. We know that the light cigarettes were a huge public health disaster because they undermined smokers' wish to quit. Smokers want an excuse to continue smoking, and if they get one, if they get a less harmful product, they will take it. And now you see that they are advertising in the same way for electronic cigarettes. Why quit? You can switch to blue. So is it a fantastic aid to help smokers quit smoking? A recent Cochrane review concluded that e-cigarettes help smokers to stop smoking in the long term. However, this statement was based on 2 studies. And the authors were very dedicated harm reduction advocates. They also had to agree that our confidence in the result is rated low. There is only one randomized smoking cessation study so far, and then there is one that is actually a smoking reduction study. But the smoking cessation study included almost 700 smokers with wish to quit. There were 3 arms. In one arm, they got e-cigarettes with nicotine, in the other, e-cigarettes without nicotine, and then some got nicotine patches. After 6 months, there was no significant difference in the quit rates when we compared the nicotine patch and the e-cigarette with nicotine, and you see the quit rates were low, it was a pragmatic, real-life study. They were around 6-7%. And those who were in the nicotine e-cigarette group, they received their e-cigarettes by post. And the other ones with the nicotine patch, they got a voucher, so they have to go to the pharmacy to buy them. And we know that there is a barrier. Many people, they never go to the pharmacy. Then there are longitudinal studies that follow people over time. 18 studies. The meta-analysis have concluded that those who use e-cigarettes, when we follow them over time, there is a 25% lower chance of having quit smoking. This review, meta-analysis, was very criticized by harm reduction people, and they said that combining users of e-cigarettes who were trying to quit with others who were not, it is like mixing apples with oranges, but it was exactly the same they did in the Cochrane review, as they included trials that were both smoking cessation and smoking reduction trials. There is a new prospective longitudinal study from Canada that followed 6,500 smokers who were trying to quit, and it shows that after half a year, the e-cigarette users had half the probability to be smoke-free as those who have not used e-cigarettes. And the number of conventional cigarettes was not reduced. Some have looked at special groups of smokers in longitudinal studies. Fat and overweight smokers, after 1 year follow-up, there was e-cigarette use was not associated with quitting, and for cancer patients at 1 year follow-up, e-cigarette use was associated with half chance of having quit. I was thinking that if you take the country in the world with the highest prevalence of e-cigarette use, we must be able to see this in the smoking prevalence. So I found a study that has been published recently that Malaysia is the country in the world with the highest prevalence of adults using e-cigarettes, 14%. Between 2006 and 2015, the smoking rates dropped from, as you see, 46 to 43. That is not very convincing, I think, on the theory that this is an excellent way of helping smokers quit. Maybe this explains a lot. This is a survey that was sponsored by the e-cigarette company, produced by e-cigarette company. And as you see, 40% of the smokers, they state that e-cigarettes help them to reduce or quit, but only 1% say that it helped them to quit permanently. And this study is never mentioned in the public by the e-cigarette industry. So does it prevent young people from starting smoking? This is what harm reduction advocates say. They say that the bad choice is that your kids start smoking, and the good choice is that if they really want to experiment with something, let them start vaping. The tobacco industry says, of course, it is for adults only, and it is very clear to see that. E-cigarettes appeal to young people. They are cheap. They taste like candy. There is no age control, more or less. You can click on the internet, just click, yes, I'm more than 18 years old, and they will send it to you. Your parents have not forbidden it, maybe, as they have forbid you to smoke. Young people like to experiment, and it is also perceived as rather harmless. And the role models, as Leonardo DiCaprio, Lady Gaga, or Kim Kardashian, they are committed to vaping. And we know that adults, and especially famous people, are role models to young people. And when we look at the smoking prevalences, they are highest in middle-aged adult people, and it is the opposite with e-cigarettes. It is the youngest people who are experimenting most with e-cigarettes. They are the first movers. This is the most recent data I have found, just published study from US, current use. And you see that actually there are more e-cigarette users among adolescents than there are smoking on only. And in between are those with the dual use. Why is this of concern? First of all, we have spent decades on tobacco control, trying to prevent that young people start smoking. And nicotine is not harmless for the immature brain. It has negative effects on an immature brain. We also know that both ex-smokers and never smokers use e-cigarettes, and we know that children down to 10 years old start experimenting with them. The prevalences are very varying across the world and very high in some countries, in some studies. And how does this influence their never smokers but vapers' intentions to start smoking one day maybe? At the beginning of these studies, they are very negative against smoking, but how does it influence when they vape? A review based on more than 90,000 children and adolescents concludes that e-cigarette users are more than twice as probable to be positive towards trying to smoke one day. And the longitudinal studies we have that have looked at how many do actually take up smoking after having been vapers only show, all of them show that the relationship between e-cigarette use and smoking, that there is a gateway effect. That means that they are more than between 2 and 8 times higher probability to start smoking. And that is even among youth who reported the highest possible level of perceived risk of cigarette smoking at baseline before they ever started. I have Poland as an example. There was an explosive increase in vaping in Poland. Here are two surveys, cross-sectional, but in exactly the same school districts with almost 100% participation, 2010 and again 2013. And there was an increase in vaping, those who ever tried to vape, from 17 to 62%. And in current e-cigarette use from 6 to 30%. But what is alarming is that at the same time there was an increase in smoking from 24% to 38% for current smokers, and increase in dual use from 4 to 22%, which is of great concern. So, my conclusions are: smokers are not fish living in a bowl isolated from the rest of the society, and the e-cigarettes are not isolated for smokers' use only. They are out there, and they are used by ex-smokers and by never smokers, by young people. So when we talk about harm reduction, normally we talk about smokers. Will this benefit the smokers? But we need to talk about how this harm reduction affects the public health. And also, it is not enough to look only at toxicity and adverse events of this product. We have to take into account dual use with cigarettes. They do not switch They use it as a supplement to smoking. Is it a good smoking cessation tool? Does it undermine the wish to quit? Is there uptake by ex-smokers, never smokers? How does it influence the social norm on smoking? Will it renormalize smoking? Is it a gateway to smoking? And a major player in this is the tobacco industry. They have a huge, huge influence on this. And of course, dual use, that is their dream scenario. Thank you very much for your attention.